The before lecture chant. An unsurpassed, penetrating, and perfect Dharma is rarely met with, even in 100,000 million kalpas. Having it to see and listen to remember and accept, I vow to taste the truth of the Tathagata's words. Good morning, everybody. Today, we're going to be continuing in the book we're studying, Standing at the Edge, Finding Freedom Where Fear and Courage Meet by Roshi Joan Halifax, abbot of Upaya Zen Center in Santa Fe, New Mexico. And this book focuses on 5 important qualities that she has identified as being vital to leading a compassionate and courageous life. And she calls these heart and mind assets. But as we've learned, these qualities also have shadow sides. And if they deteriorate, they can cause harm. Thus, she terms them opposing realities or edge states. And we've discussed the first of the 5, altruism, and today I'll be talking about the second, which is empathy. Now, at our high edge of empathy, we're able to open and bring awareness to others and to sense what they might be experiencing. And it's our capacity, in Roshi's words, to merge with, to include, to understand, and or to identify with the experience of another. And we might say that it allows us to actually put ourselves in their shoes. Empathy can, of course, be a precursor to compassion, and it is definitely a part of compassion, but they're not exactly the same. Empathy, she notes, is really feeling into a person, into another, while compassion is feeling for another with the aspiration to take action that benefits others. So, although empathy is so very important, it does not necessarily lead to action. Empathy is a very important, crucial even aspect of our interconnectedness with the world, and it plays such an important role in what we learn from Thich Nhat Hanh and what he calls interbeing. And when I was reading this chapter, the image that came to my mind was an ancestor story, a koan, if you will, entitled Ling Zhao's Helping. And some of you might be familiar with Ling Zhao and her father, Layman Pang. We actually studied this with Mary Allen when we were studying out of the Hidden Lamp, so you might be familiar with the names. And this is a family, a very enlightened family that lived in the 8th century. And it's really a family that epitomizes using, sorry, hold on. Get rid of my little icon there. Using enlightenment and acceptance of enlightenment as it happens in relationship. And this was something very important happening in Buddhism at the time. They focus on relationship. They lived a modest life. They were deeply committed to the way and to each other. And in fact, all of them, including Ling Zhao's mother, were considered enlightened beings. And all of them with a good amount of humor, but none more than Ling Zhao, actually. And this is one of the stories. One day, Layman Pang and his daughter Ling Zhao were out selling bamboo baskets. And coming down off of a bridge, the layman stumbled and fell. And when Ling Zhao saw this, she ran to her father's side and threw herself to the ground. "What are you doing?" cried the layman. "I saw you fall, so I'm helping," replied Ling Zhao. "Lucky no one was looking," remarked the layman. So there are so many ways for us to interact with this text and this story. And I have to say that most often, this story is usually told as a poignant and humorous example of compassion, which obviously it is, of course. But I'm bringing it up here because To me, her initial response inside of her, what might have motivated her to throw herself to her father's side, the precursor to her compassionate action maybe, seems to be empathy. We can certainly see that she is putting herself right in her father's shoes. And Ling Zhao's reaction is really a good example of somatic or physical empathy, a strong physical resonance that we can have with another person. If you take a moment, you can probably think about examples in your own life of somatic empathy, especially in the relationships in which you are close. And when we experience this, it happens like that. It happens without thought or preparation, as it did with Ling Zhao. It's spontaneous and it's automatic. And when we can feel what another person is feeling physically, that is something I think that is familiar to us. Mothers certainly speak of this when their child is in pain, of feeling the pain of their child. Most of us have no doubt experienced somatic empathy with someone with whom we are very close. One time I was at a friend's house and I was weeding a garden bed that was raised up off the ground from the adobe tile patio, up maybe 2 or 2.5 feet off the ground. And when I finished, I didn't think about it, but I stepped on this end post of the retaining wall, this wooden piling that was there at the end. And I was just kind of gonna jump off of that. And the wood was rotten though. And as I put my weight on it, it completely crumbled underneath me. And I fell really hard to the ground. It kind of took my breath away for a moment. And I heard the loud shouts of my friend, who was actually standing very close to me. She said, "Oh no, Patty, that hurts so bad." And her face was showing such pain and fear for me, with me, not for me actually. And, I was fine. I had some scrapes and some pretty good bruises to show. But honestly, one might have thought that this had actually happened to her. And it felt that way to both of us. Now, of course, her empathic response was intense at that moment. And we might not always feel that level of intensity, but this kind of empathy is essential to caring for each other. And in fact, the whole world. And as we've discussed when we talked about altruism, these edge states tend to have harmful sides. And of course, that's true for empathy. This kind of attunement, for an instance, with another person's physical experience is very important. And it's part of what motivates us to care for others, including those we don't even know, maybe. But if we tend to over-identify with someone else's pain and suffering, taking it on as our own, problems can definitely arise. And this may take us in a way that we turn away, that we run away, or we shut down, thus being unable to be present. So this is a very slippery, fine edge, really. And I especially think of our healthcare workers, our caregivers, facing suffering up close every day. And not only suffering, of course, but staying present with it. And caregivers and therapists are normally given some pretty effective training in how to not over-identify, to be able to separate another person's suffering from their own. And those of us who practice, all of us, we have tools to bring us to the reality of why we are there, who we are serving, and what we are experiencing inside of ourselves. We have a practice that teaches us to not look away, not from our own suffering and not from any other person's. Tools that help us stabilize, that help us ground our body and come more fully back into the present moment. We can do this, and we do it all the time, I think. And I can still feel a moment that I experienced this like this when I was when I was in my hospice volunteer time. And I had spoken to the son and the caregiver of a 96-year-old woman who was still living in her home, and up until some months earlier had been actively taking care of things around her home, as people do up here in the mountains. And in the city, of course, too, but as she had always done. In fact, it was chopping and then hauling wood at 96 into her home up a ramp that led her to being bedridden, unable to move on her own. She had fallen while hauling this heavy load of wood right up to her door and had broken her back and her shoulder. And she really couldn't move her own body. So the caregiver, who had been with her for some time, had to move her in order to bathe her and change her and her clothes and change the sheets and so forth. But any movement of her body caused her excruciating pain. Although as soon as you stopped touching her, she stopped crying out. So I was there to help him turn her to her side so he could change her dressings. And he told me what to do, where I should hold her, how firmly I should hold her. And he gave me all these directions to minimize the impact on her. And then he said, now. And we moved her legs just ever so slightly, and she immediately started crying out in pain. And the caregiver immediately stopped. And he looked at me and he said, I'll do it tomorrow. And I encouraged him. I said, look, I'm here. Just let me help you with this. We can do this together. Stressing that how important it was for him to keep her wounds clean. But his eyes were filled with tears. His face was pained and frightened. And he said, again, I'll do it tomorrow. And he quickly walked away and sat down in his chair. And so I pulled up a chair in front of him and just listened to him. And obviously, you can imagine, he was very traumatized and had been for many months, totally overwhelmed. He clearly had great love and compassion for this woman. Just being there, obviously, was a compassionate act on his part. But her severe pain was now in his body. And he had long suffered sensory overload and protected himself by just shutting down and walking away until he had to do it again. Overwhelm and oversensitivity and over-identification can really harm us. But we know also that healthy empathy, that which doesn't knock us down or turn us away, helps us stay connected and leads us to skillful action. The Dharma teaches us to find the middle way. And in this case, it was somewhere in between, for him, too much sensitivity, leading to overwhelm, becoming numb and unable to be present and aware. And Roshi reminds us to keep a strong back, soft front. And I keep coming back to this bringing together of the mental qualities of equanimity and compassion as we tend to absorb and then release the somatic experiences of others. Now, I just need to say that, of course, there was a lot of trauma in the room for him, and he really needed relief. So I'm not trying to minimize that he just needed to stay, but he was so overwhelmed with the situation, and this can happen. This can happen to us. And it doesn't have to be this dire or this drastic. So I want to return just for a moment to Ling Zhao and her father. After I read this story a few times ago, it really stayed with me, this image of Ling Zhao immediately and spontaneously throwing herself down. And I really felt as if we were falling down together. And as I was writing this some days ago, I could hear those words from Roshi that I shared with you last week, that we are always in free fall together. And to me, that's just a beautiful image. And there's connectedness in it, and there's freedom in it. And there was certainly a freedom in Ling Zhao's somatic physical empathy, which led her to have this spontaneous, compassionate response and this total lack of self-concern in the moment. And no doubt we can think of times when we put aside our own concerns, our own stories even, and we just stayed in the face of someone's experience. So there is in this story and in any empathic response, the willingness to not flee, a willingness to bear witness in an intimate way that fills up the space with concern for another rather than self. And our empathy manifests, of course, not only as a somatic response, not only as a physical response, but also as an emotional one. In fact, this may be most familiar to us, our capacity to take in the emotional experiences of others and to inhabit that experience. We can notice ourselves doing this often, I think. And by internalizing that pain, or in fact that it could be the joy of others, it helps us greatly to understand them better and can bring us closer and more connected. So this too is necessary for a caring world. And here too, we can fall off the edge. So it's so important to be able to distinguish our own emotional state and experience from that of someone else's emotional state and experience. And I actually know the moment when I first understood this. It was a friend of mine. I'd known her for a while, but in her life was there was a lot of stress and distress. And she would frequently call me and just needing to tell me sort of an emotional way what she was experiencing. And over time, a long time, it just became a lot for me. And, I felt like I listened to her and I felt deeply what she was telling me. But, over time, I became overwhelmed. And actually one day I said to her, that I was really feeling stressed about this and how much I was being affected. And she stopped and she quickly looked at me and she said, "Well, this is not happening to you, This is my life." And I thought, I'm not sure I knew that at the time. It felt very much like my life, to be honest, because it felt as if I was experiencing it also. And it was a moment that I am still grateful for to this day, because it reminds me to check in, to find that higher edge where I can support someone but remain attuned to and distinguish my experience and what I'm feeling from the experience of someone else. That was a valuable lesson, and I thank that friend to this day. And one more form for empathy, which is cognitive, and this capacity we have available to us to see someone else's perspective, to see through someone else's eyes, to expand our awareness and our way of thinking to include the experience of another and their views. And this is valuable too, our ability to sense how others might see and interpret the world. It can help us go beyond stereotypes and generalizations, actually, which is very good. But it has a shadow side. We can lose our own perspectives, leading perhaps to straying even from our own moral compass. So because I inserted the story of Ling Zhao and Li Peng into our discussion, I'll return again to them to finish an explanation of the story. At the end, Li Peng says, "Luckily, no one was looking." And with these words, he's not really suggesting that there are other people who might have seen this happen, but rather it's generally thought that he means, luckily, we ourselves are not looking. We're not monitoring and judging our own behaviors. We're not inserting our own stories into this spontaneous moment. And what freedom there is in that. Empathy and compassion really are necessities of life, not luxuries, Roshi says. Empathy is crucial to cultivating compassion, to seeing things from another's perspective, being present to the whole catastrophe, she writes. And we have what it takes. And as we know, this practice of ours cultivates empathy and compassion. In fact, meditation practice hooks up all the various parts of our brain and mobilizes immunity. And the outcome, so the science says, is that meditation practitioners tend to feel suffering more, and importantly, they return to their baseline sooner. We can handle it. We are building through our meditation a resiliency and an equanimity that supports our very actualization of empathy and compassion. It's fundamental to our being able to bring forward the very best of our human hearts in support of friendships, families, communities, societies, and this very earth.